Hey, I'm Mark Safe. One of the things that makes a story compelling is the setup. The same holds true with bluffing. A bluff made at a random, ragged board is much less believable than a bluff at a board where you could have been slow playing a big hand. In this lesson, we're going to discuss 3 of the best types of boards to bluff at so you can tell your opponents a more believable story when you're stealing the pot right out from under their nose. As we've already discussed, floating is one of the best ways to convince your opponents that you're holding a strong hand even when you're not. What makes this play even more convincing, though, is floating your opponents on a scary board that could have brought a straight, a flush, or even a full house. Let's start with a paired board like 10-10-3. Boards like this represent great bluffing opportunities because if you play your hand right, your opponent can only call your bet, most likely, if they're holding a 10 in their hand, or in this case, pocket threes as well. If your opponent bets into you on the flop on a paired board like this, you can float him by calling and take the pot if he checks on the turn many times. If your opponent bets the turn instead of checking, you can still take the pot by raising him here. Even a strong hand like pocket jacks or queens will probably fold in this spot because you've played the hand like you're holding trip tens or a full house. Because even strong hands will fold to this type of play, this bluff can be very effective. But be careful if your opponent shows any real interest in this pot. You need to give it up and cut your losses. Many players would raise holding a pocket pair in this situation, but if a player holding a 10 won't raise there, then neither should you. By raising instead of calling, you're telling your opponent that you don't have trip 10s, and you give him an opportunity to push you off the pot by re-raising you. Instead, turn your hand into a bluff and flat call on the flop, and then bet or raise on the turn to represent a bigger hand than you're holding. The next board to look at is a suited board. When a board comes with a flush draw like Jack 8 deuce with the Jack and 8 suited, take the same line as you would with a paired board and just flat call your opponent if he bets into you. Even if the flush doesn't come on the turn, your opponent is likely to check, giving you a chance to take the pot with a bet. And if the flush card does come, you can represent that you've made your draw and take the pot if he's scared that his hand is no longer good. Suited boards also present good bluffing opportunities even when you're out of position. In this case, you can check call your opponent on the flop and lead out if the flush card hits the turn, since the story makes sense because someone with an actual flush draw is likely to play their hand the same way. The last board to look at is one that contains a dry ace. Again, this play works best when you're in position because you can flat call if your opponent bets on a board like Ace 9-3 Rainbow. Because there are no flush or straight draws, it is very hard for your opponent to give you credit for a hand without an ace in it after you call, and he'll likely try to bet unless he has a very strong hand. If he checks, go ahead and represent your ace, and you will usually be able to take the pot right then and there. This is another board that you can bluff at out of position in the right circumstances. For example, let's say a player raised from late position and you called from the big blind. Since a player who raised in this spot is unlikely to have an ace, you can check raise this flop and take the pot down. Do not, however, try this play against an opponent who raised from early position, as they are much more likely to be holding a strong hand that contains an ace. You can also float your opponents on the turn and leverage scare cards on the river. If your opponent checks to you after a scary card hits the river and the only way you think you can win the pot is to bet, then go ahead and represent that you made your flush or your straight. But be really careful here. You have to be able to accurately evaluate your table image because some opponents will check to you to induce a bluff. Basically, it comes down to whether you're telling a believable story or if you're just doing what your opponents want you to do. Remember, there are times when scary boards are going to work against you as well, especially when you are playing against more experienced opponents who may use your aggression against you when they actually have that big hand. Pick your spots carefully and don't fall in love with bluffing just because it worked once or twice. Even the best stories get old when they're told too often, and going to the well too often may convince your opponents that your hand really isn't as strong as you'd like them to believe.